Hi students, in this section I'm going to be covering how to decide if your question is a testable one. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is, are you indeed asking a question? The second thing is you need to make sure you have an independent variable. That means you're changing only one thing in your experiment. And also you need to be sure you're measuring something, and we call that the dependent variable. So a little bit more on that as we move forward. A good sign that you have chosen a good experiment is that you are comparing something. So here's some question examples, and I've actually gotten some of these as a teacher. Let's look at the first one, the 5-second rule. So what's wrong with that? Well, that's not a question. So this student actually wanted to look at if this was true, if you could drop food on the floor and if it was still good, or if it'd go bad the longer it was on the floor. So we need to modify that question. How about the second question? What is better, ice cream or chips? Well, that is a question, but it's more of an opinion question. So in science, we want to deal with a truth or a fact, not someone's opinion. Number 3, are ghosts real? Well, the problem with this one is we really can't test it. So we don't want to choose something that we can't test. And how about the last one? How good is my Wi-Fi signal? Well, this is good. It's a good question. However, what are we going to change in our experiment? What's our independent variable? It's not really set up to test anything yet. So here's some examples of good test questions. We've modified that 5-second rule, and here's how we've written it. Do apples left on the floor for longer gather more germs? Here's another one. Which soda brand has the largest reaction from Mentos? And does changing the height of my router improve my Wi-Fi signal? So I've kind of modified that last question. How good is my Wi-Fi signal? We can see a better question to ask is changing the height. So I'm actually changing something in my experiment. I'll be comparing the height, or comparing my Wi-Fi signal to different heights of my router. Okay, so let's look at that first one. This is how I would set it up. I always like to draw a table for myself to make sure that I have independent variable and dependent variable. So if you don't know, your independent variable will go in the yellow section. So let's look at this question. Do apples left on the floor for longer gather more germs? So what is going to be our independent variable? We know it's going to be in the yellow section. What are we changing? You need to ask yourself, what am I going to be changing in this experiment? And then for the dependent variable, we are going to gather data. So let's look at the first section. Our independent variable is the amount of time the apples are on the floor. So I'll be changing that time. And how will I gather my data? It's going to be the amount of germs. How much growth in a petri dish? So I actually had a student do this. So let's look at how we'd set it up. I'd be changing the amount of time. So I have, in my first section, I have apples that were left on the floor for 0 seconds, and then apples left on the floor for 5 seconds, and then apples left on the floor for 60 seconds. And how are we going to measure it? Well, we need some apples, right? And we'd slice them and we'd put them on the floor for varying amounts of time. And then this student in particular was actually taking swabs of the apples and growing cultures in the petri dish. Okay, let's look at another example. What effect do exercises have on human heart rate? So what will our independent variable be, and what will our dependent variable be? Well, we are changing the type of exercise. And how are we going to measure this? Well, what effect is it going to have on human heart rate? So we need to take our heart rate after each exercise, right? Your heart rate after each type of exercise. So let's look at the types of exercises that I've chosen. We have swimming, we have walking, and we have biking. And to conduct this experiment, we'd have to take our heart rate after conducting each of these exercises. So this would be an example of taking my heart rate after each type of movement. And we obviously want to do this multiple times, as we always want to do in science, to have multiple trials. So here, what do we learn? Is my question testable? Make sure you ask yourself, am I asking a question? Am I changing one thing only? Do I have an independent variable? And am I measuring something? Do I have a dependent variable? And lastly, am I comparing anything?